Hey everyone, Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5 Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Hey there, Rush Nation. Here we are. Week 1 almost in the books. Just got tonight's game, Monday Night Football, Jets and Bills to go. But man, so good to have football back. Cannot believe it's... Can't believe week 1's already in the books. You think that's 1/17 for the 1/18 for the season gone. And it just goes in a quick flash. But it's so great for it to be back. Lots of storylines, lots of exciting things. From last night, unless you're a Giants fan, and probably slightly less. That was a pretty awful start to the season for them, but unbelievable to have it back and to see the quality. And I know that there were some teams that are very disappointed. I know a lot of you have got fantasy teams that didn't play up to expectations. Those of you were Bengals players, I've got Bengals players, didn't live up to expectation. There's a lot of players that didn't do what we thought they would do. And that's pretty standard for week 1. It doesn't always click into gear. You got to remember, preseason is virtually a non-event now for most of these star players. Most of them don't really play. They don't have a lot of time to get going. So week 1 is just an opportunity to get going. So don't panic if your team didn't do well this week. It can't be lost in the first week. But if you are looking to make some changes, because you had J.K. Dobbins, who is unfortunately out for the season, or, you're looking at your lineup, you're looking at your teams, with Cooper Kupp going to IR and you've got a roster spot, or you're just looking to freshen up that bench a little bit, don't you worry. I've got all the picks here that you will need, and let's get straight into it. So let's start with some quarterbacks. Not that I should imagine any of you are really looking for quarterbacks, but if you are, 2 quarterbacks you can look at here. Brock Purdy, 24.5% owned, 16.8 fantasy points. Solid. Never going to be a huge, amazing stand-up, challenging for QB1 options, but he's got such a safe floor and he's very consistent every single week. He's the first player in NFL, or first quarterback in NFL history to win his first regular season starts by throwing at least 2 touchdowns as well in the process. He's also the highest QB rating across those 6 games. He's getting about 95 points every week on average. So pretty amazing stuff, really, for a guy who was Mr. Irrelevant or last year to be doing what he's doing. So definitely worth a safe floor pickup if you are looking for a quarterback. Another one is Jordan Love, 15.8% owned, 23 fantasy points. Now, I talked about Jordan Love and said on the flagship show, and I've said a few times this season, I just can't believe that he's going to be bad. And he was massively slept on by analysts, by the community. This isn't me victory lapping. It's one game. He could be. But at the same point, I just look at it and think, you kept this guy on your roster for 3 years. You traded Aaron Rodgers. There is something in him. And he's a former first-round pick. There is something in this player that they like as an organization. And that is why they have gone and started with him. They've gone with that confidence. And he put in an excellent performance against the Bears last night. So I'm not sitting here projecting that he's going to be a top 5 fantasy quarterback or even a top 8 fantasy quarterback every week. But people have slept on him, thinking he can't do much if he's not playing for 3 years. And that's a fair comment to a degree. But he was behind Aaron Rodgers, and this is what Green Bay do. They've done this from Favre to Rodgers, and now they've done it from Rodgers. Well, they did it with Favre. Favre waited a couple of years, and he took over. Then Rodgers waited 3 years, he took over, and now it's Love. I'm not saying Love is the next Favre or the next Aaron Rodgers. Far from it. But there is a player there, and we started to see that last night. So if you're looking for a decent fantasy option, I think, for me, Jordan Love has been slept on. His ownership will go through the roof this week. And if you are looking for a solid backup option with high-end upside, Jordan Love might be that guy. So you've got a floor play in Purdy, and then you've got a high upside play in Jordan Love. Moving on to those running backs, Tyler Algier, 44% owned. So again, probably not going to be available in all your leagues or most of your leagues, but the Falcons do run the ball a lot. And we saw Bijan's going to be this weapon across the field in the receiving game, and he's going to get carries. But Tyler Algier is going to do a lot of the work on the ground as a north-south runner. They were very happy with him last season. Bijan was using a very different archetypal type of weapon. And Tyler is going to get work. He's going to be that sort of flex play every week with high upside. Like this week, he was extraordinary with 24.4 fantasy points. But that's not going to be him every week. I'm not saying you own Algier to start him, but he has to be rostered more than that, and he has to be available on benches. He's going to be a good bye week play. He's going to be a good flex play when you're struggling. So I like Algier. I've got him on some rosters. Definitely look towards and see if he's there. Let's talk about Roschon Johnson. Mentioned him a couple of times on this podcast. 21.7% owned, 17.5 fantasy points yesterday. He is going to be the guy. I said all off-season I didn't believe in Herbert. Didn't believe he was going to be the true one, because why would you sign Donta Foreman? Why would you draft Johnson? Donta Foreman got hurt. He's missed a lot of the preseason. I thought he would start stronger than he has. He didn't have a bad game, Donta Foreman. But Roschon Johnson, you can see this now. I really genuinely believe he is trending towards being the guy to own in that Chicago backfield. So 21.7% owned. Get in on him now. Again, not predicting him to be an RB1 most weeks, but I'm sitting here thinking he has got to be owned more than that as an RB2 flex option for sure, and that usage will go up. Another one, 21.7% owned, is Kenneth Gainwell. All off-season analysts, beat writers have been telling us that Kenneth Gainwell was going to get a huge amount of work, and he did. Rashard Penny was a scratch. He was a healthy scratch, which is a real concerning sign for him. And it's all pointing towards Gainwell getting significant work in this offense. He's going to be a committee back. He is going to be someone who, again, limited upside. But again, that safe floor appears to be there. 11.4 fantasy points, could rush in some touchdowns. He's a player, again, who's got to be owned more than he is, considering what this position could be like. Stocking your bench with these types of players, there is going to be some opportunity to play them as the seasons go on. Let's move on to Kyren Williams. He's around about 10% owned. 17.4 fantasy points yesterday. I'm not saying he's going to do that every week, but he's the clear handcuff to Akers. More importantly, it looks like he's the successor to Akers. He looked really, really strong yesterday. The way that they're lining him up in certain packages, and the way that they're going to try and utilize him, he's going to get work through the season. But we know with Cam Akers as well, he always has a tendency to get hurt. He's never really played a full season. So with Kyren Williams there, he looks like he's going to be a successor. It looks like if the Rams struggle, which they didn't yesterday, but if they do tend to struggle towards the end of the season, that usage of Williams can go up. So I really like adding him. 10% owned will be available in most leagues. I'd be adding him onto as many benches as you can. He looks like a really good option. Let's talk about what's going on or what might happen in Baltimore. So you've got here two options. You're going to have Gus Edwards or Justice Hill on the back of J.K. Dobbins' really awful injury yesterday, season-ending Achilles injury. That looks like that probably going to be his career, and it's unfortunate the amount of injuries that he's had. He's out for the season. Now, Justice Hill got all the headlines. He was the one that got the goal line carries. He was the one that scored the points, 12.9 fantasy points here. 12 of those points were touchdowns. You can't bank on that every week. The players in your league who are going to just look at who scored the points and perhaps not have watched the games or watched the utilization will all point to Hill. And also the fact he's 0.3% owned, he's available in every league. So I'm not saying don't add him. Absolutely add him. But just keep an eye on Gus Edwards. He's about 30% owned. Gus Edwards was the guy who did a lot of the work and got a lot of the carries and be a lot more of the consistent running back. So it's going to be a two-headed committee between Edwards and Hill. I would lean towards, if available, Edwards. I think Edwards is going to get more work. I think it's going to be more steady work and more projectable work. And I think the touchdowns will potentially come. Hill might be used in more of those sort of flashy packages and 2-minute drills. Actually, maybe not. Yeah, and goal line work. And so I think I want a part of both of them. If I had to pick the one I'm more likely to play in the lineup every week, it's going to be Edwards. But if Edwards is owned, I'm quite happy to shove in on Hill. I think if you're talking about fab, for all the players I've talked about, Algier is the one I'd probably put the most fab on. He's the most owned. He's going to have the biggest role going forward. I'd be looking at sort of 5% of fab for Algier. I'd look about 5% of fab for Roschon Johnson because I just believe in where the trajectory is going to go. I really believe he's going to be the back to own in Chicago. For Gainwell, Williams, Hill, Edwards, I think significantly lower. But I think on Hill and Edwards, I think you're going to need to put more than 5% of fab on those players to get them. I think you might need to put as much as 10%. You've got to assess your roster and see if that's worth it. For Williams and Gainwell, I wouldn't put more than 3% of fab on them. I think that Williams is going to have more value. I think Gainwell is going to be useful, as I said, but I just think there's a limited upside there, just the way that Philly run their offense. So I think if you can get any of these players, great, but don't overspend. It's week one. Don't panic too much. Quarterback fab. I didn't mention quarterback fab because really you don't want to spend more than $1 on them. Just because it's a backup QB. These guys aren't going to be QB1 options. Don't spend more than you need to. And if someone goes and bids $5 from, good luck to them. Let them have them. Don't spend more than $1 on your backup fab. It's like an auction draft. You just don't spend that much on those kind of players. Let's move to wide receivers. There's quite a few to talk about here. Let's start with Zay Jones. Zay Jones, 30.1% owned, 16.5 fantasy points. I talked about him in the matchup show. He's, or on the pod last week, that he's kind of like this solid player, 10 points. He's not going to give you a lot of upside. And then here I am talking about him on the waiver wire. The reason I'm talking about him on the waiver wire is actually I kind of thought that the usage warrants this. Now, in the preseason, we saw him lining up in a lot of the 2 wide receiver sets with Calvin Ridley. And Calvin Ridley, by the way, is a monster for what he did yesterday. Considering he's not played for nearly 700 days in the NFL, phenomenal performance. But it looks like that Zay Jones is the guy to own over Christian Kirk. I'm not saying drop Christian Kirk, but if I'm a Christian Kirk owner, I'm severely worried because Zay Jones played a lot more of those 2 wide receiver sets than Christian Kirk did yesterday. He caught the touchdown. I really am starting to see that Zay Jones could be, and it's one game, so let's not overreact, but I'm starting to see this trend. Saw it in the preseason, saw it again last night, starting to see potentially this trend to Zay Jones being the wide receiver 2 in Jacksonville. And if that's the case, I want that because Jacksonville is going to be a good offense. They play in a poor division. They're going to have plenty of the ball. They're going to score a lot of points. They've got the offense to do it. I would be looking to try and get a piece of Zay Jones. For me, worth 2 to 4% of fab. Have a spin on him. See what you get. I don't agree with spending much more than that, but he's someone that I would be really interested in. Let's talk about some of these lower owned. The rest of these are all under 10% owned because there's a bit of a parity between sort of that 30% owned and then all the way down. But there's some great names that came out. Let's start with Kendrick Bourne. 1.5% owned. Not a player I thought we would talk about this season. Completely off my radar this season. It's got 24.4 fantasy points. He's the wide receiver 4 on the week going into tonight's games. Wide receiver 4. It's mad. But he got 11 targets yesterday. 11 targets. Parker didn't play. Juju, Juju looks lost, doesn't he? He looks like he's almost finished. He looks like a player who's played for 20 years and he's just sort of hanging on. Kendrick Bourne was the guy who got the work. And admittedly, they were heavily behind early and then were chasing a game. And I'm not sitting here expecting Kendrick Bourne to be the guy every week. But 11 targets? That says to me there's something there that we don't know that we need to explore. And he's worth an ad just on that. I think it will go under the radar. I think you can get him quite cheap. $1, $2, 1-2% of fab. It's a speculative ad. I'm not sitting here saying that he's going to be phenomenal for the rest of the season. I'm not sitting here saying you should chase week 1 performances. But if you're in a league, especially a deep league, and you need to add something, Kendrick Bourne is probably a guy that you should be looking at, especially in those deep charity leagues, if they do waiver wires, like the Scottish Bowl, or if you're in a league where you got a lot of bench spots. Kendrick Bourne, there's worse players to add. I like guys who get targets. I like the volume. Could be a one-off, but I like the look at it. Let's talk about, speaking of one-off, Puka Nacua. Stokes talked about him last week and talked about how he's a player he really likes. 2.3% owned, 21.9 fantasy points. He's the wide receiver 8 on the week. And we're wondering what's going to happen now Cooper Kupp's out. Well, it looks like Puka Nacua is going to play the Cooper Kupp role. 15 targets he got. He led the league with Tyreek Hill in targets this week so far, going into tonight's games. I can't imagine that's going to get matched or beaten. So it looks like those two are going to be the leaders in week 1 in targets. And it looks like he's going to play that role. 110 yards, a touchdown. yeah, you got to add Puka Nakua, at least in the short term. And this could be a fluke, but this could be what we're going to see at least for the next few weeks. And then if Cup doesn't come back off week 4, you're effectively, I'm not saying you're buying Cooper Cup's volume or role, but you're buying a significant piece of this. And you're getting it for a couple of dollars of fab. I wouldn't go mad again. I'm not saying spend 10% of fab, but if you can get him for under 5% of fab, and you've got to think about all these. I'm not saying you add all these players I'm talking about. You've got to look at your league, look at the context, look at your bench, look at what you need. But if you're going to add someone at the wide receiver position this week, Puka Nakua is the guy I want to own because he's the one with the highest ceiling, but it might be for the most limited time. So you've got to be a little careful. You don't want to sit here and blow a huge amount of your fab that you're going to need later in the season on Puka Nakua. But at the same point, I think, again, he might go slightly under the radar in some of those quieter leagues. In the deep league, he's going to be expensive. In like the Scottish Bowl, you're going to need to spend north of 10% of fab. You're probably going to have to spend closer to 20 because there's just not that many players with that kind of volume and potential. So he's a player you got to own in that kind of format and worth spending the money on. A player I've talked about absolutely loads in the history of this podcast, and he pops up again, is Robert Woods. I said many, many times on this podcast this season, I don't understand Robert Woods' ADP, and I don't understand his ownership. His ownership declined this week. He went down to 2.7% owned. I don't get that. He's the clear wide receiver 1 on his team, and he's owned by 2.7%. I know Houston are bad. Like, I get it. They're not a good football team. They're not going to score a ton of points. But somebody has to get the ball on that team. It's going to be Robert Woods. 10 targets yesterday. It's not exciting. It's not sexy. He's not got a high ceiling. But that floor is as safe as it comes. He's got 11.7 fantasy points in what was a pretty awful offensive display. That's a floor for me. It's going to be about that level. So 10 targets, add Robert Woods, 2.7%. And I think because it wasn't sexy, I think you can get him for 2% of fab for sure. Let's talk about Kansas City. Let's talk about Rashee Rice, 9.5% owned, 11.6 fantasy points yesterday. This is one you're kind of trying to buy in on, hoping it pans out. Again, this is a real speculative ad potentially. He played only 31% of snaps, but he looked good. He looked sort of, for me, the pick of the wide receivers in terms of the threat. Really hungry, got the draft capital. We've talked about him a few times. I definitely think he's a player that's worth an ad. Wouldn't go crazy again, 1 to 2% of fab. I think you can get on Rashee Rice. I think he'll go under the radar. I don't think, again, he's a player that a lot of people, I think, they'll chase potentially Zay Jones. They'll chase maybe a couple of other wide receivers. I don't think Rashee Rice is one that loads of people are going to go in on. And I think you've got to be a bit cautious as well. If someone wants to go all in and push in on him, then let them, because I wouldn't go crazy. I don't think you need that kind of, 31% of snaps. That's a concern. But he did look good on that. Looks like he could earn more through the season. I think he's going to need to earn more. There wasn't really a proper standout in that team. He did get the touchdown. That's encouraging. So one to keep an eye on there. And then if you're in a really super deep league, let's talk about Trey Palmer, 0.6% owned. Scored a touchdown yesterday, 8.8% owned. He's a wide receiver 3 on the Bucks, which didn't look overly appealing coming into the season. They looked a bit better on offense than perhaps, especially myself and maybe others expected. Very, again, speculative ad. If something happens to Mike Evans, which he does go down a few games a season typically, or Chris Godwin, and then, Trey Palmer is a guy who's going to step up. He's wide receiver 3. He's going to get standalone volume anyway. It looks like they want to incorporate this guy more and more. A lot of buzz about him in camp. Again, 0.6% owned. You can get him for 0. I'm pretty convinced no one is bidding on him this week. So I'm pretty sure if you've just got a deep spot in a deep league and you're looking for someone, Trey Palmer's a guy that don't need to spend any fab on him. I reckon you can pick him up for nothing, stash him away, and see if that grows and develops further. I think it will. I think it's worth the speculative ad. Wouldn't spend fab on him, but I think in a deep league, he's worth an ad. Tight ends, just 3 to talk about this week. We'll start with the most owned, Zach Ertz, 39.7% owned. He had a funny day yesterday. 8.1 fantasy points, not overly sexy. He had a stat line was 6 for 21. I mean, I don't quite know how that happens, but it did. I know that the Arizona offense is great, right? But they put up some points. I think Dobbs at times looked okay. I think he looked all right. He wasn't outstanding, but he showed some good ways. Considering he's been on the team 2 weeks and he openly admitted he doesn't know the names of all the players on his team, and he's glad they've got their names on the back of the jerseys. But Zach Ertz got 10 targets yesterday. There's not many tight ends that are going to get that kind of volume. I think that's a pretty consistently safe volume. It wasn't sure if he was going to be available. He looks healthy. He looks good. 39.7% owned. He's worth an ad of $1 maybe if you're struggling at the tight end position. A lot of injuries this week, very much a wasteland. But the two to really target, Hunter Henry, 4.1% owned, 16.65 fantasy points. He is the tight end one this week. And he's, don't worry about Mike Gesicki. He is nowhere. It's Mac Jones, it's Hunter Henry. We've seen this the last couple of years. He's very much a touchdown-dependent player, but he's someone that, especially at Foxborough, gets a lot of touchdowns. He's a home touchdown player. He likes to get a lot of touchdowns at home. If you look at the propensity of and the volume of his touchdowns at home versus away, they tend to mostly come at Foxborough. So a player to add, player to have on your bench, especially if you got someone like Chig who was really disappointing. I'm not saying you abandon him, but you need to have a plan B. Hunter Henry could be that plan B. If not, Hayden Hurst, 4.8% owned, 15.1 fantasy points. He's the tight end 2 on the week coming into tonight. There's just no wide receivers really. Adam Thielen was disappointing. Jonathan Mingo wasn't that great. DJ Chark's hurt. So there's not a huge amount of wide receiver volume. And I think when you've got that situation there, it tends to be that the tight end will get the red zone work. He scored yesterday. He is going to be that red zone option for Bryce Young as he continues to develop and improve. You're chasing touchdowns with Hayden Hurst, but I think he will score a decent amount this season. Again, not saying you should start him, but he's someone that you should keep an eye on and add. Both those guys, or all three of those guys, wouldn't spend a lot. It's back in tight end position, $0 to $1, maybe $2 if you want to push the boat out and desperately get one of these guys. But they are, they're touchdown dependent wide receivers. Savert, he's got a safer floor because of that volume. He's going to get a decent volume this season. DST streamers of the week. If you're streaming your DSTs, there's 2. One, I'm going to hover pick here. The Buccaneers, 9% owned. Again, probably going to go under the radar, but they scored 3 turnovers yesterday. They held a very, very good Minnesota Vikings offense to just 41 yards on the ground. I mentioned the 3 turnovers. They held them to just 17 points. All signs go well. They've got Chicago this week. Chicago have a run team, don't put a lot of points in the air. And then when you look at the fact that the Buccaneers are so much stronger on the ground, like I said, they held Minnesota to 41 yards rushing. They've always been consistently in the last 3 or 4 years. This defense hasn't changed much in that time. It's been consistently brilliant at stopping the run. It's always been top 3 ranked offense in stopping the run or defense in stopping the run. They're going to do the same. It's a really good matchup for them to tackle. So I really like the Buccaneers defense this week. If you want to go really contrarian, the Colts defense, 0.9% owned. They had a good outing yesterday against Jacksonville. They got turnovers. They held the Jags till late, really. It was only really a late flourish. But they've got Houston this week. So again, you're looking at targeting those rookie QBs like CJ Stroud, where they haven't got a lot of offense. This could be a really good opportunity for the Colts to capitalize there with they've got a really strong defensive unit, especially that linebacker position and that defensive line. They're going to get pressure, they're going to get sacks, they're going to potentially force some turnovers on Sunday. So really like them. 0.9% owned, so they should be free. Have them as a speculative streaming pick this week. Finish on the kickers. 2 kickers this week to target. Nick Folk, 2.6% owned, 18 fantasy points. I think he's the kicker 2 on the week. Really simple. He's consistently always been very, very consistently good, accurate kicker. Surprised he left New England, really. I guess it was a cap thing. But he always has been a very good and consistent kicker. He's going to do the same for Tennessee. And, they will rely on him. They're not going to always be able to punch in points. So I'm looking at him thinking he's going to be a good, solid option. Jake Moody in San Francisco, 5.5% owned. San Francisco look good on offense, don't they? They're going to look good on offense for a while. So you want to get a piece of that offense, and that includes the kicker position. So have a look at him. He's worth an ad, absolutely for sure. And that's going to do it for the Waiver Wire this week. Appreciate you tuning in. Appreciate you looking and listening to us. I hope you found this session useful. Sorry if towards the end of that there was a bit of lag for viewing, but I hope you find it useful. Regardless, and I'm looking forward to catching up with all of you, hearing about your week 1 picks. don't forget you can get in contact with me at Murf_NFL. Don't forget the Patreon. You can subscribe for just £1 a month. There's other tier options available where you get some merch we send to you after a certain period of time. But get in touch there as well, because you join the WhatsApp group. There's some great minds in there, and you get access to me and your teams. I'm going to always answer questions from the WhatsApp group and from the Patreons first. Not always going to answer questions through Twitter, but I'll try and get to as many as I can. So just go through there. But anyways, looking forward to catching up with you later in the week. I'll come back with the matchup show. Check out the Dynasty show tomorrow night. But as always, don't forget, keep rushing.